Good morning from Los Angeles. I want to thank you all so much for inviting me to be here today. I know a few of you, and from reading through the rest of your bios and reading about your work, I'm both impressed and also a wee bit intimidated to be here. When I was invited to speak today, I was asked to reflect on my visions for the future, both challenges and opportunities. That seemed like a fairly straightforward assignment until I really started to think about it. So let me start with some of the challenges I see. It's been an exceptionally challenging year for all of us. We're still enduring a global pandemic that's exacerbated and highlighted already existing inequities. And in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and too many others, we have seen an extraordinary movement explode calling for racial justice, not only in the US, but around the world. It's a cliche too often quietly accepted as true that we're living in a golden age of documentary film. After all, with Netflix and Apple and Amazon, we have more outlets than ever before. We have more money in the system than ever before. Everyone says that they go to see Sundance to see the documentaries because they're cool, they're the best films there. I would argue that we're actually living in the corporate age of documentaries. The documentary world is shifting from one that has a social and democratic function at its core to one that's market-based, and that threatens the future of the field. The corporate age is driven by the bottom line, and thus privileges genres such as true crime and filmmakers who have the longest track record. It risks further marginalizing those filmmakers who do not have access to those with power and resources, and it risks driving filmmakers out of the documentary field. Despite this illusion of an influx of money into our field, many filmmakers are having a hard time just making ends meet. A recent study that IDA is just about to publish shows that a full 75% of filmmakers have to do work outside of filmmaking just to make a living. 74% of filmmakers reported that they've been negatively impacted by the pandemic. Of that group, filmmakers of colour and female filmmakers are the most economically disadvantaged in terms of film income, revenue, and access to the bigger money that the streaming networks can offer. It's pretty staggering that in this so-called golden age, that 3/4 of filmmakers are just struggling to pay the bills. And just as society is going through a reckoning on race, we're seeing how that reflects within our own documentary community. In the US, we've seen questions around authorship grow more pronounced. Filmmakers and communities have begun to ask questions of a system that has favoured white filmmakers over filmmakers of colour. They've been asking who has the right to tell their stories. Now, I recognise that when this question of who gets to tell the story comes up, that can really spark a fear of censorship. And I want to ask you to just resist that for a moment, set it aside. No one is saying you cannot tell the story of another community as an outsider, and you can't tell that story very well. But it is reasonable to ask about the ethics of authorship, power and position, to examine one's motivations, particularly when one is telling the stories of communities that have been systematically marginalized. Now, all that sounds pretty bleak, I know, but I'm Scottish, and frankly, that's just our natural state of being. But I do think there is hope. I do think that we collectively have power to make change and build a stronger, more equitable documentary system. So how can we do that? First, I want to talk about the power that you have when we join together and work together in coalition. I know that maybe sounds Pollyanna-ish and simplistic, but let me give you a couple of concrete examples of how it's played out here. In 2018, at IDA's Getting Real conference, we had a whole slate of sessions around the banner Decolonize Docs. They were organised by loosely formed coalitions of filmmakers like Brown Girls Doc Mafia, the Asian Documentary Filmmakers Alliance, Filmmakers with Disabilities, amongst others. And they were asking questions about authorship and identity. They were asking who gets to tell the story and from what point of view, who gets the funding and who gets to greenlight it, who gets to be at the table when those decisions are being made. but not too many people were listening back then. Fast forward to our Getting Real conference this past September in the middle of a pandemic, and these conversations and questions had moved from the margins to the centre. What had started as loose coalitions of filmmakers had evolved into groups that are now beginning to exert some real measure of power and influence, not only on commercial outlets, but on our public broadcasters and on funders, pushing for transparency and accountability within the systems that support our field. Just recently, they challenged PBS in the US about how funding and broadcast hours are concentrated in just a handful of favoured filmmakers. Conversations are now actively ongoing to push PBS to live up to its mission and to work with a wider range of filmmakers and support them. And they're beginning to make inroads on the commercial side of the industry and with foundations too. Another example is the Documentary Producers Alliance. They were formed to create more equitable relationships between investors and filmmakers around profit sharing and crediting. Their guidelines have been promulgated widely and have become industry standard, at least here in the US. And they're helping to rebalance power dynamics which beforehand were heavily weighted in favour of investors. So rather than just complain about a broken system, they're putting forward concrete solutions and holding people in power to account by coming together just as we like to do in our films. None of these changes have happened overnight, but because these filmmakers work together, they're affecting real systemic change. That's one reason I think it's really important that we join and support organisations such as the New Documentary Association of Europe, but they can't be the only group advocating that filmmakers get the largest slice of the pie. There needs to be other coalitions working in concert with them. Now, I want to return to this thorny questions of authorship and diversity in our field. Documentary has its roots in a colonial practice where the gaze of privileged filmmakers told the stories of the other. Just look at the work of Robert Flaherty. Again, I'm not suggesting that you don't have the right to tell any story that you want to, but I do think that we all have an ethical duty to ask ourselves a set of questions. Why am I the right person to tell this story? What impact will this story have in this community when I leave? What are the motivations? What are my motivations and connections to the community? And do I have people on my team whose experience and perspective and background is different from mine? I think if we can honestly answer these questions yes, then we'll end up with richer, more complex, more honest, more artful stories. And if you can't say yes, then perhaps that's a moment, perhaps that's a chance to rethink the team, the approach, how you're thinking about the storytelling. So I take the conversations around authorship not as an obstacle, restricting the stories we tell, but as a way for us to hold ourselves accountable to tell the best stories that we can. And for those of us in positions to hire people for crews, for other jobs, we need to make sure that we're making space for new voices, that we are hiring new people in positions of authority, bringing new people to the table. Let's not default to the position of just hiring the people that you know or that look like you. With each film that you make, you have an opportunity to support new talent in the field. When we do that, we'll build a stronger, more diverse and vibrant field. So remember, people need your stories, and in that need, you have an untapped collective power to make change. I'll start that paragraph again if I can. So remember, people need your stories, and in that need, you have an untapped collective power to make change, not only with the stories that you're telling, but within the systems that support them. Let's use the challenges of this past year to reimagine what our documentary field can look like. Thank you.